The SEC is no longer operating at a position of strength, and it shows in their statements, in their actions, in the way they are responding to things not going very well for them in the postseason. Whether it was the whining, complaining, bitching, moaning that they didn't get enough teams into the college football playoff, then being kind of proven wrong for their whining, bitching, complaining, moaning that those teams that they were pounding their chest about, that these teams did deserve to be in the college football playoff, and then went out and laid an egg during the bowl season. Then the teams that did make the college football playoff not performing all that well thus far in the college football playoff. And I know that Texas is still in it, and Texas has a chance to beat Ohio State and play in the national championship game, but they didn't beat Clemson as heartily as people thought they would be. And then they nearly choked away a game against Arizona State, a team that many had argued didn't deserve a bye, and some had said didn't deserve a spot in the field altogether. That's your best hope right now for the SEC. And I understand the idea of this being a difficult spot for the SEC to be in, because for the better part of 2 decades, they have dominated the sport. When push came to shove, you went with the SEC team because they had better players, they had better facilities, they had better everything. And when push came to shove, they won. They won the national championship time and time again. It makes sense. It hasn't gone that way last year. They have a 25% chance to win the national championship this year. And they're not, as collectively as a whole, handling it all that well. And it's easy to point out, it's easy to see. For instance, after Notre Dame made what Kirby Smart thought was an illegal substitution, he comes out in the press conference afterwards and says, the head of SEC officiating said that was illegal. Why were you in contact with the head of SEC officiating between when the game ended and when your press conference started 10 minutes later? The idea, and believe me, I understand that this is probably not how it went down, but the idea that Georgia got their ass kicked, and they were in a tough spot, you backup quarterback, first start ever. They got their ass kicked. And the idea that Kirby Smart runs to his phone after the game and it's like, head of SEC officiating, tell me that was illegal because it felt like illegal. You got beat by 2 touchdowns, okay? You coming out the next day and being like, man, it wasn't, not even the next day. You coming out 10 minutes after the game and like, it wasn't fair. That was an illegal substitution. That sounds like whining. When the conference comes out and says, it's not fair that we didn't get enough teams in the college football playoff, it's whining. You are whining because you didn't get your way. It is the equivalent of, did you have, like in your school, a family that had like 2, 3, 4 daughters, and one prom king, one homecoming queen, and then the last one's like, well, I deserve to be the prom queen or the homecoming queen because this is just what my family does. I'm entitled to this. Well, no, you're not. That's not how it works. Just because things went well for you folks in the past doesn't mean that that's just simply how it goes forever and always. So the SEC has some regrouping to do, because if they want to stay the top dog on the block, and you could probably argue if they want to return to the top dog on the block, they need to make some adjustments. I don't know how I feel about the entire thought process, the talking point that it sure is interesting that since NIL came into play, that the SEC has dropped off a little bit, that everybody else gets to pay their players, because I think you're naive if you think that Ohio State, Notre Dame, USC, Clemson weren't paying players before they were supposed to be paying players, and that it was only LSU, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee. I don't think that's true. I think everybody was paying players under the table before that. So I don't think that's a valid concern. I do think there are a couple of differences, however. The SEC did really well for a really long time, and I've talked about this in the past, that there are eras of college football. We are just now getting out of the facilities era and entering the NIL and transfer portal era. And the teams who do really well in NIL and transfer portal are going to do really well. You saw it last year. Florida State did really well in the transfer portal. They go 13-0, win the ACC. They didn't do so well in the transfer portal this year. Things did not go well for them. The SEC dominated the facilities era. They had and have the best facilities. Now, that's still an important part of the college football recruiting landscape, right? Kids are going to care about facilities. After they care about how much you going to pay me, it's always going to be a second. And being great at the facilities is easy when you have a bunch of rich old white guys who want their name on stuff. So when you can say, hey, we're going to name the player lounge, we're going to name the locker room, we're going to name the barbershop, we're going to name the DJ booth, we're going to name anything you want to slap your name on. It's how, like, some head football coach, like, he's the James T. Bottomtooth class of 1984 head football coach. Great. People want to slap their name on shit. I saw the other day that there was an exit ramp. I was driving home from South Carolina. My wife and I went to South Carolina for Christmas, whether it was in South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky. There was an exit ramp that was named. An exit ramp? We're naming exit ramps after people? But if you're going to give a lot of money to a college, university football program, you want your name slapped on stuff. So that's really cool. Forever, this is going to be called the whatever, insert name here, locker room. That makes people feel all warm and fuzzy inside. It gets their money out of their pocket. When you're like, hey, I need $1 million because we got to pay this left tackle. That doesn't have the same cachet to it. And so when you've had the money in the past to do the things that you need to do because old rich white guys want their name on stuff, it's a different sales pitch when you're like, hey, we need to get better in the secondary. So I need some money. Well, that's a little tougher sales pitch. So I think that NIL part is part of it, because I don't know how many folks told you that Ohio State's losses to Oregon and Michigan are embarrassing because they had a $20 million roster. They didn't do anything wrong. That's the name of the sport in 2024, 2025. However much money you can get to give to the players to then help get the best players. At the end of the day, the sport is about the best combination of getting the best players with the best coaches. It's pretty simple when it all boils down to it. Now, it's easier said than done. It's more difficult to accomplish than that. But it's a simple process. I need as many great players as I can get to be coached by the best coaches. That's it. That's the key. And so the idea that you sit around and bitch because everybody else is spending all of this money in NIL, well, they're not doing anything illegal. They're not doing anything wrong. And that's another, like, hey, we are seeing our status from the SEC's perspective. We are seeing our status diminished in the sport when it's not fair that these other schools are spending more money than we are. It's not fair that these schools are getting more opportunities in the college football playoff. And there's been this kind of brainwashing of they have the best players, therefore they deserve the benefit of the doubt. I saw I don't know if he's the president or the guy who runs the Senior Bowl essentially argue the day after the college football playoff rank field was announced that, hey, if you're going to ask NFL talent evaluators, scouts, GM, player personnel, etc., they're going to tell you that the best players reside in the SEC. That if you were to figure out which rosters have the most NFL talent, that it's not Indiana, it's not SMU, it's South Carolina, it's Ole Miss, It's Alabama, which is essentially saying, like, hey, the games that happen on the field, they shouldn't matter. It should strictly be who's got the best players. And you can argue strength of schedule. And I've said before, if you're arguing strength of schedule, it's not because you won. It's not because you won your way and earned your way into the field. It's a last-ditch effort. It's a last chance to say, well, hey, yes, we have some losses on our resume, but no. Strength of schedule is not a defense used by teams, used by programs, used by conferences that are operating from a position of strength. And I think until the SEC recognizes, like, we are no longer living in a world where we simply get the benefit of the doubt because there's a little SEC patch right here on our chest, the longer that this dry spell works out. Now, I recognize that there's still a chance that the SEC wins the national championship, that Texas can beat Ohio State, can beat Notre Dame or Penn State. They've got as good a chance as anybody because they're one of four left in the field. But I think it might play into the idea of a team in the first year in your conference is the one that's waving the banner for y'all, doesn't necessarily make the strongest case that we're still the top dog, baby, because there's more to it than that. But until the SEC starts to recognize that you are no longer getting the benefit of the doubt simply because you are one of these 16 teams, until they get there, they're going to continue to have problems. And I don't know how fast they're going to recognize and rectify the fact that for 20 years, you've gotten the benefit of the doubt, and justifiably so. I think it's fair that when you go out and you win the national championship year after year after year, it's easy to say they're the best. They've proven it. But now you got to prove it against a little bit bigger, expanded field, and it hasn't gone your way the first time. You can either complain, bitch, moan that it's not fair, it's not equitable, you're not looking at the total complete picture, and that our teams actually are better than everybody else. But when the results show that over the course of the last 2 years, or especially this year, when the argument is Alabama deserves to be in over Indiana, and a team that Indiana beat the dog piss out of beats Alabama, it's hard to look at that and go, oh, yeah, you know what? I think you were right, because that was all anybody could talk about. That first college football playoff game that Notre Dame beat Indiana with no issues. And it was quick talking point. Indiana didn't deserve to be there. And I tweeted, I caught all sorts of hell from Alabama fans that the idea that if Alabama was the opponent instead of Notre Dame, that the result would be drastically different is preposterous. That Alabama would have performed significantly better than Indiana did was ridiculous. Now, that's not to say that maybe resume, or not resume-wise, but maybe on the field, is Alabama better than Indiana? Potentially, and maybe even probably. But the idea that they were just going to walk on the field and put on a better performance than Indiana did was ridiculous. And then you see what Notre Dame does to Georgia, and that goes away. Nobody says Georgia didn't deserve to be there because they got their ass kicked by Notre Dame. That's the champion of the SEC getting mollywopped by Notre Dame. They've got a lot of things to figure out. And how they get back to the top of that mountaintop, I don't know. I've got some ideas. I think you got to dive headfirst into NIL and get all the rich old white dudes who have paid money for you in the past to have the visiting locker rooms named after them and the field named after them and all whatever else they can get named after them. You got to figure a way to get that money to the players, because that's all that matters in the NIL and transfer portal era. And the sooner you figure out that the era has changed from facilities to NIL and transfer portal, the faster you're going to get back to the mountaintop. But some people are stubborn. Some people don't like change. One of my favorite sayings is the two things people don't like is change and the way things are. And right now, the SEC is in a spot where the two things they don't like are change and the way things are. And you got to figure out which one you're going to accept, because otherwise you're like a cinder block sinking to the bottom. And you're going to watch everybody else float above you. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day. However it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. Goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily Huddle.